My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Today's podcast is an incredibly useless podcast. Well, it's my hope that you'll find it useful, but I will try and teach you about one of the most famous passages in Zhuangzi. It's his passage on the useless tree. I was doing an application for a cool China program that I'm trying for, and I was asked as a part of the application to think back over a Chinese thinker who has influenced me. And the answer was obviously Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi's been incredibly important to my career in Chinese literature. Actually, it was Zhuangzi he's the first piece of Chinese literature that I read. And the passage that I wrote about for the application was on Zhuangzi's useless tree. Now, I keep using this name Zhuangzi. I should give a little bit of background information. Zhuangzi was a philosopher. Well, maybe he was a philosopher. We think there was a guy who existed. His name was Zhuangzi. If he was a real person, then he was born around the year 369 BCE. For those of y'all keeping track, that's in the Warring States period. If he existed, he died around 286 BCE as a nice old octogenarian, and he was given the title of Zhuangzi, Zi being the honorific that just means master. So literally Master Zhuang. Other people who are given this title, Master Confucius. So in Chinese, his normal name is Kongzi, Mencius Mengzi. Zhuangzi wrote a book, or I should say something kind of like a book. It's really more of a series of short essays that we call a book. The book itself is confusingly called Zhuangzi as well. It consists of three parts: the inner chapters, the outer chapters, and the miscellaneous chapters, the Nei Pian, the Wai Pian, and the Za Pian. Now, as I alluded to a minute or two ago, we don't really know if Zhuangzi existed. The first writings we have about him are probably the Sima Qian biography of him in the Shiji, the records of the historian. This was written a couple of centuries after he died, and it's a pretty sketchy account. So not super trustworthy, but he very well might have existed. And if he did exist, then he probably wrote the inner chapters, the Nei Pian, but not the outer chapters. The inner chapters, when you read them, you can see this cohesive logic connecting everything together. The inner chapters sound like they're something that was written by a single person. You can kind of feel the internal cohesion, the logic. And just from looking at the text, recent scholarship has pretty clearly established that the language of the writings of the inner chapters seem to be the oldest. And finally, we think that the inner chapters might be the writings of the real Zhuangzi, because that's what Chinese tradition tells us. From very early on, Chinese scholars said that the inner chapters were probably written by Zhuangzi himself, and these scholars probably had access to tons and tons of works that since then have just disappeared, so we should probably trust them. The outer chapters really don't have the same kind of feel. Sometimes they contradict stuff written in the inner chapters, and sometimes they are just off the wall. That doesn't mean that the outer chapters in Zhuangzi aren't good to read. In fact, some of the best stuff from the Zhuangzi comes from the outer chapters. I'm thinking particularly the passage on the autumn floods that Rob and I did as a part of our Zhuangzi mini-series last year. That passage is from the outer chapters, and it's one of the coolest passages in the entire book. But overall, the outer chapters just feel very different. The writing just doesn't seem the same. As I mentioned before, Sima Qian, the famous Chinese historian, well, actually the first Chinese historian really, he has a short biography on Zhuangzi, the Book of Han, the Han Shu. This is a dynastic history written about 2 centuries after Sima Qian. It's by a guy who really did not like Sima Qian. That biography refers to Zhuangzi as having 52 chapters. We don't have this 52-chapter version anymore. Lots of scholars think that this 52-chapter version may have been the original work. We don't know because we don't have it. What we do have today is a 33-chapter version of the book that was prepared around 300 AD. So that is all very useful information. When do we get to the useless stuff? Let's turn to the useless stuff. Zhuangzi has this reputation of being this chillaxed answer to the stiffness of Confucius. And in the book, he actually makes fun of Confucius for being too stiff. The useless tree is a story that I think really speaks to that chillaxed atmosphere of the Zhuangzi. So the useless tree is a parable from the book. There are actually two different versions. Both of those versions are from the inner chapters. One occurs in chapter 1, right at the end of chapter 1, and the other occurs in chapter 4. Both of them involve basically the same parable, though the chapter 4 version is a bit longer and has a bit more in terms of detail. The parable goes like this. Carpenter Shi learns about this tree. It's old, it's ugly, it's all bent in a bunch of different directions. It's so big that it's hard to use. Carpenter Shi says something like, this is an ugly tree and it's completely useless. It's so bent out of shape that it cannot be used to make furniture or anything. It's so big, I can't do anything with it. In the version in chapter 4, Carpenter Shi has the tree actually appear to him in a dream afterwards, and the tree tells Carpenter Shi, and I'm just going to read this bit out for those of y'all who are following at home. I'm getting this translation from A.C. Graham. This is coming from the tree itself as he is appearing in Carpenter Shi's dream. There are trees which by their own ability make life miserable for themselves, and so they die in mid-path without lasting out the years assigned to them by heaven, trees which have let themselves be made into victims of worldly vulgarity. Such are the consequences with all things. I would add that this quest of mine to become of no possible use to anyone has been going on for a long time. Only now, on the verge of death, have I achieved it, and to me it is supremely useful. Supposing that I had been useful too, would I have had the opportunity to grow so big? The version from the parable in chapter 1 is similar. It doesn't actually have a dream. It lacks some other details, but it does end with this cool poem that I'm going to read. Spared by the axe, no thing will harm it. If you're of no use at all, who will come to bother you? And that poem is really the message of everything that Zhuangzi is all about. We live in a society where use and usefulness are praised. Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country, as JFK said. Zhuangzi lived in a society that was similar, where being an official was the best thing you could do with your life. Confucius runs around trying to serve different kings. They keep not accepting him as an advisor. But Confucius's goal was to search for a job where he could be used by kings. But Zhuangzi looks at all of this with skepticism. He notes the connection between being useful and getting used. That's in that passage with the trees speaking to Carpenter Shi in the dream. Why try to be useful? What good is it to you as an individual? Do you benefit from being useful, or do you just end up getting used by others? Zhuangzi is encouraging his reader to think through things not from the perspective of others. Don't think about how you can help others. Don't think about how you can help your country. I know that message can seem a little off-putting in a world where we praise altruism, but I think there's really something profound here. Altruists, as admirable as they may be, are oftentimes the ones who are most abused. There's a tendency for people who are cynics, who do look after themselves, to try and abuse altruists. People oftentimes say, hey, altruism is great, but in their heart of hearts, they're really looking to use those people. There's a kind of proto-libertarianism that we can see in Zhuangzi. He's advocating for a sort of individualism. It might not have all the components of the post-Renaissance individualism that some folks in the West like to think of as individualism, but it is individualism nonetheless. There's another way we can think about this useless tree. Sam Crane is a Chinese philosophy professor at Williams College, one of those fancy liberal arts colleges tucked into the middle of nowhere, New England. He specialized in Taoism, and he wrote a blog called The Useless Tree. The blog tried to use Zhuangzi's parable and Zhuangzi's other writings to understand the son born to him who was severely disabled. He was unable to see, unable to walk, unable to do much. In other words, his son was entirely useless. But whereas some might say that's a mean word to use to describe his son, Aiden, I think looking at Aiden through a Zhuangzian lens, we can understand the beauty of uselessness. Professor Crane finds beauty in the short, useless life of his son in several very touching passages. And he also has written a book about it called Aiden's Way. So beyond the be useless, don't get used interpretation of Zhuangzi, there's something else that we can find in this passage on the useless tree. We live in a society that praises usefulness because it wants to use us. That society also has a tendency to relegate those who are not useful to the margins. But if we take Zhuangzi and look at life through Zhuangzi's eyes, we see that every life is valuable. In fact, that uselessness is something that we should strive for. And I think we can find beauty in those in our society who have been pushed to the edge. Those who are useless still matter. I love Zhuangzi. I think he's one of the most profound thinkers in world history. And I think this passage speaks to why that is the case. Okay, as I'm winding down, today's Chengyu is from the Useless Tree passage in chapter 1 of the Zhuangzi. It's 才大难用. That is, this material, this stuff is big, and thus it is hard to use. If you liked today's podcast, or if you hated it, send me an email, ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. I love getting emails from listeners, though I'm sometimes not the best at replying in a timely manner. Sorry about that. If you want to show your support from the podcast, think of supporting me on Patreon, Chinese Literature Podcast at patreon.com. That's it for this episode. Please go out into the world and be as useless as possible. That is certainly my goal. Oh, wait a second. Should I actually use the term goal, or is having a goal having too much of an aim and not being useless enough? Well, anyways, you get the idea. I'm Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.